Hi, I'm Cambrielle Yildirim. Welcome to Making History, where I talk to you about the American Revolution and U.S. history while I put on my makeup. If you're enjoying these videos and want to see more, please like and subscribe, click that bell to get notifications, and share this with your friends. Now, last week, I left off talking about some of the causes leading up to the revolution from the 7 Years' War onward, and I kind of left at a spot right around when the Boston Tea Party and the coercive acts happened. So I'm going to pick back up there, and kind of last week I glossed over the Boston Tea Party, and I promised I was going to talk more about these events. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. The Tea Act of 1773 was kind of the final straw when it came to the acts that Parliament had foisted upon the American people. Like I mentioned the other day, it in effect actually lowered the price of tea and lowered the tax on tea, but the colonists were not happy with this. They could see right through the transparent attempt to sell them tea at a lower price, but to still pay that tax in an underhanded way. So before the East India Company ships even arrived to the U.S. ports, they were still, or the colonies' ports rather, before the East India Company ships even arrived to the colonial ports in America, the people of America had been protesting heavily and had successfully gotten the tea consignees to resign in almost every port except in New York and Boston. In Boston, the ship Dartmouth arrived, and then shortly thereafter was followed by the Eleanor and the Beaver. These merchant ships arrived. The people of Boston were adamant that the tea would not be offloaded because they were not going to pay the tax. But Governor Thomas Hutchinson insisted that the tea would be offloaded. So on December 16th, 1773, an unknown number of Boston men dressed as Native Americans got on board the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver and threw over 342 chests of tea into the harbor. This became known as the Boston Tea Party. Now, as you can imagine, when word of this so-called Tea Party reached England, no one was happy about it. Well, except for those who actually stood with the colonists. But the king certainly wasn't happy, and he wrote to his prime minister, Lord Frederick North, "The die is now cast. The colonists must submit or triumph." General Thomas Gage, who was the commander of the British military forces in the colonies, was then in Great Britain when he heard the news about the tea being thrown into the harbor, and he was outraged. He helped draft a number of acts that would be passed by Parliament under Lord North, and these acts were called the Coercive Acts because they were intended to coerce the Americans back into submission. But the Americans titled them the Intolerable Acts, and I'll run really quickly through those. You had number one, the Boston Port Act, which closed the Boston Port to business in or out. Number two, you had the Massachusetts Government Act, which was extremely egregious. It destroyed the colonial government in Massachusetts and replaced it with a military dictatorship under Gage, and that would come to directly lead to the outbreak of violence and the war. Number three, you had the Administration of Justice Act, which George Washington called the Murder Act because he believed that British soldiers and British officials would literally get away with murder. The idea behind that act was if a British official was accused of a crime, he would not stand trial in the colonies where it occurred. Instead, he would stand trial back home in England by a jury of his peers, which technically, under English rule, you were entitled to trial by a jury of your peers, but they were deliberately removing these men to England where they would find a much more sympathetic jury. The fourth was the Second Quartering Act, which expanded upon the original Quartering Act In the original Quartering Act, you kind of had mostly they would quarter soldiers in uninhabited structures, so it still was a violation of your rights. But the new Quartering Act, the soldiers would actually be living in your home with you, with your family, in inhabited structures. You would have to feed for them, provide for them, do their laundry, wash their bedding. This was clearly a violation of their rights. And of course, the colonists saw it for what it was. It was just a way to keep tabs on them and control them. As I mentioned, the actions of Lord Dunmore in Virginia, shutting down the Burgesses, had led to the creation of Continental Congress. So people from all of these colonies, from 13 of the colonies, are picking delegates to send to the new Continental Congress. So at the Old South Meeting House in Boston on June 17th, 1774, a group of men are there electing delegates to send to the First Provincial Congress. Gage gets word of what they're doing. Number one, they're not supposed to be meeting without his permission. Number two, what they're doing is obviously rebellious. So he sends Thomas Flucker, who was the Secretary of the Council and Henry Knox's future father-in-law. He sends Flucker down to give them a cease and desist order. Now, the men carry on their meeting in spite of Flucker banging on the door. They won't let him in. So he stands outside the door and basically reads to them Gage's orders and tells them, you have to stop. But they ignore him. They elect the delegates, and there's really nothing Flucker can do but just sit there and read the instructions from the other side of the door. So then, shortly after that, in Salem, they are electing men. They are meeting illegally, and Gage gets wind of it, and he sends troops down to arrest 7 of the leaders, and his intention is to stop this rebellion. A bunch of angry militiamen, like 3,000 men, threaten Gage. He's arrested their leaders, he's threatening their rights, and Gage wants to do more, but he knows that every able-bodied man of a certain age is going to have firelock, shot, powder, all of that. So he just says, damn them, I won't do anything unless His Majesty sends more troops. Now this is on August 24th, 1774. So they continued and had yet another meeting in Danvers because Gage knew he couldn't do anything to stop them because they were a very well-armed people. So on September 1st, 1774, you have this incident that would become known as the Powder Alarm, where Gage sends men down to seize the Charlestown magazine. Now, in those times, every colony had a powder magazine where many of the colonies' arms would be kept. And of course, this was true in Charlestown, just like anywhere. These arms belonged to the people. The governor could, through proper channels, seize those arms if he feared an armed uprising. But he really didn't necessarily fear an armed uprising as much as he feared people fighting back against his tyranny. But people were furious about this. Now, the militia heard rumors of bloodshed and that Gage was killing their men. This was not true. They started to march, but then they turned around when they found out that these were just rumors. And so then after that, Gage begins confiscating guns from private homes, from private citizens against the law. Gage is acting on his own here. And he's taking guns from private citizens without warrants, without due process, without any right to do so. Now, because of this action, because of this Charlestown powder incident, Dr. Joseph Warren then drafts what will become known as the Suffolk Resolves, which are passed on September 6th, 1774, or they're introduced on September 6th and they're passed 3 days later. The idea is they're going to reject the government under the Massachusetts Government Act, this military dictatorship that has come in and taken over here. They are going to refuse to pay taxes under the act. They're going to boycott any British goods that they are supposed to purchase under this act. They are going to try to get these officials to resign. They're going to press this military dictatorship. They're going to fight back. And so these are adopted on September 9th, 1774. So right around that time, the First Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia. Peyton Randolph, who was the Speaker of the House of Burgesses in Virginia, will oversee this Continental Congress. He'll be the first president of Continental Congress. Continental Congress will meet from September 5th to October 26th, basically to discuss the situation going on in Boston, the situation going on everywhere here in the colonies, and what they can do about it. And they close on October 26, 1774, with a petition to Great Britain. You know, how can we work this out? How can we work with you to get things back to the way that they should be? How can we get our rights restored as Englishmen, which the English have been trampling on for years now? During this time, the militia in Boston and other parts of Massachusetts are going around threatening officials of Gage's military dictatorship, threatening them to resign and give up their posts, and they are successful in getting a lot of these men to resign. So this is, basically what they're going around doing during all of these political events. So on October 4th, 1774, you have the Worcester Convention. Basically, the people in Massachusetts know that things are really heading toward the point where they're probably going to have to go to war. They're really not going to be able to successfully work this out with England, or so it appears. And then, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress plans for war. They create and delegate these committees of safety, and they start making plans to procure firelocks for the men in the eventuality that they're going to have to actually go to war, which most people know by now that it's going to come to blows. So in Virginia, because Lord Dunmore had outlawed the colony's representatives, George Mason, who was a colonel of the militia and an influential Virginian, created the Fairfax Militia, which would be placed under the command of Colonel George Washington, and they would be under the authority of Mason and Washington. They would not be under the authority of the governor. Normally the militias in the colonies would belong to the governor or would be under his authority so that he could call them up whenever needed, but they were not going to obey Dunmore's orders. So the British then take things another step further in Boston, and they decide that they are going to outlaw the exportation of any arms and munitions from England to the colonies without a permit. However, they will not give any such permits. So they make it sound like it's something that they will do if you have a permit, but they will not issue these permits. It's just another clear way to control the colonists and keep them disarmed. Now, Lord Dartmouth, Sir William Legge, speaks to Gage and urges him to start completely disarming the colonists. His thought is if they can completely disarm the colonists, they can quell this rebellion and it will be over. But Gage replies to him that he can't do that without considerable force. He needs the king to send a whole lot more troops in order to actually take the weapons of every man in Massachusetts. And when his reply becomes known across Massachusetts that he would like to do that, but he needs more troops, people are really angry at Gage because He wants to take their arms, and he wants more soldiers and more force. So they're really not happy about that, obviously. So, knowing that Gage is trying to disarm the people, Paul Revere, the Boston silversmith, rushes to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where there was a planned raid of Fort William and Mary. There were many muskets, pounds of shot and powder and all of this there. So December 14, 1774, Paul Revere arrives, and they're able to rescue these supplies and get them away from the hands of Gage and put them in the hands of the militia, so that Gage can't get a hold of these things. Now, British Parliament on February 9th, 1775, declares Boston and all of Massachusetts to be in a state of open rebellion, which of course they are. And Gage's entire problem here is these colonists are well armed. He is worried about the arms and munitions the colonists have. He cannot subjugate them as he would wish to do because they are very well armed. So Gage really wants to get his hands on the public stores of weaponry, and he really wants to confiscate the guns of private citizens so that he can subjugate them. Now the committees of safety begin really heavily planning these networks and alarm systems so that they can go to each other and they can carry news of what the British are doing, what the British regulars are doing, and when they're doing it. And the idea is to stay in touch and stay abreast of things and be able to stay one step ahead of the British, because they're not going to take this lying down. So they've got these networks in place, they've got riders in place, they've got plans for how to deal with Gage. On March 20th, 1775, you have a group of men meeting in Richmond, Virginia at St. John's Church for the Second Virginia Convention. And one of the things they're voting on is to make preparations for the war or the fight that most certainly is coming. And once again, you have Patrick Henry, who gave this ardent opposition to the Stamp Act, coming forward and giving this fiery speech, which he is now known for best of anything, on March 23rd. And he is telling them, that the war is actually begun. It's on our doorstep. I expect to hear news of it any minute. What is it that men want? Men cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. And he asks them, do you want peace at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And so they vote to start pulling these militias out from the authority of Lord Dunmore and placing them under the authority of these delegates and this network of rebels, really, to plan to stand up against the British regulars and anything that they might do. And so this is the beginning of really making preparations for war that everyone knows by this point is coming. So in April, Gage starts fortifying Boston, and he's obviously making a garrison with earthworks, entrenchments, earthen fortifications. Everybody knows that he's going to have to defend the city. So a lot of rebels and the rebel leaders and figures start fleeing Boston. They're trying to keep from being arrested by Gage. Some of them don't want to be caught there in Boston when things go down. Samuel Adams and John Hancock both flee to Lexington, Massachusetts. And so Gage sends spies to Concord, Massachusetts, to the magazine, but they're not very good spies because they're recognized by the people and they are not very successful in their mission at all. Now, on April 8th, there are some soldiers in the harbor repairing longboats, and Dr. Warren thinks that they are probably preparing for some sort of action. So he sends Paul Revere out to go and raise the alarm in the network of the Committee of Safety and kind of let people know, hey, the troops are doing something, we're not sure what. But it turned out to be a false alarm. They really didn't do anything other than cleaning and repairing boats. So then on April 14th, Lord Dartmouth says it's time to put down this rebellion. No one really knows what that means. As far as the colonists, Warren suspects maybe it's to arrest some of these leaders like himself, John Adams, John Hancock, Sam Adams, all of these men. So he's not really sure where this is going at this point. April 16th, you have another false alarm where it looks like they're getting ready to mobilize, but they don't actually do anything. April 18th, you have the real deal. So Warren finds out through intelligence that the troops are getting ready to go out to Lexington to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, and to Concord to take over the magazine there. So he sends William Dawes out to ride and warn people of the troops mobilizing. Dawes is joined by Paul Revere and William Prescott. Now, those three, along their ride, they encounter some British troops. Paul Revere is arrested. Dawes is unhorsed. Prescott goes on to continue and ride. At the same time, you have Israel Bissell actually for days riding around Massachusetts and informing people of what's going on. So on the next morning, that's when you have the beginning of the war. But I'm going to cover that in the next video. This is where I'm going to end for today. And I'll talk about Lexington and Concord and everything that happened on April 19th next week. In the meantime, I'll actually be doing a mini episode, which will be like a biography of Henry Knox. So if you want to see more of those, like biographies of different people involved, just comment below. Tell me you're interested. Tell me who you're interested to hear about. Like I said, the first one will be Henry Knox. But feel free to comment and tell me what you're interested to hear about. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them below and I'll try to answer them. Or you can go to my Facebook. I have Facebook for both my Walking Tour business and Patriot Podcast. So you can look up Victory Walking Tours or Patriot Podcast, which is facebook.com/snowsisland1780. Meantime, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next week.